Well, let's continue our conversation on the breaking news and bring in our legal panel for a fair and balanced discussion. Criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Bob Bianchi and trial attorney Nicholas Fortuna joins us now. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Bob, I want to start with you because we had heard now that the district attorney plans to retry this case, and I just want to first ask you, what is he up against?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, please?
I want to ask you what the DA is up against if he tries to retry this case.
Well, listen, the inertia, the ball is rolling downhill. As a prosecutor, you never want to retry a case. It's as simple as that. You have the burden of proof. You have to prove it to 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense now knows your prosecution strategy. They have transcripts for all the witnesses that testified. So if you can imagine that aggressive kind of cross-examination that occurred in this trial, you can only imagine what it's going to look like when they have the transcripts from the trial. So the inertia is really, really tough for the prosecutor in this kind of case to retry it and get a conviction, in my opinion.
Nicholas, I want to bring you in because we heard from Gloria Allred. She held a press conference. She had two alleged victims with her, and she had said what she took issue with in this particular trial is that there was 13 women that she wanted to testify, and only one was able to do so. Now, whether or not that was because the statute of limitations is way beyond my pay grade, but I want to ask you, if those women weren't allowed to testify, is it a possibility that we could see them in the future, and would that change the outcome?
It could change the outcome if you have more people piling on, accumulating evidence about the fact that Bill Cosby committed certain acts. However, I would say it's very, very dangerous for the judge to allow that kind of testimony. The appellate courts don't like prior bad acts coming in to influence what happened in this particular case. If you look at the testimony, Kelly Johnson testified that Bill Cosby had attacked her, and has nothing to do with what happened to Andrea Constant. Now, if they allow more victims to testify, it's likely...
But from a prosecutor's standpoint, you want that even if it doesn't have anything to do with your case, am I right?
Elizabeth, as a prosecutor, I got to tell you, I agree with what he's saying. There's an evidence rule, 404. I hate to get technical about it, but in court, you can only introduce that kind of evidence if it's relevant to something other than bad character, or that if you did this before, you must have done it here. That's exactly the reason you're not allowed to admit it, because they don't want to have multiple trials within trials. So as a prosecutor, when I've had 404 evidence that gets admitted, like was done in this case with one witness, you have to be very careful that you don't pile on bad character evidence, and then in the appeal, the courts look at it and say, the jury was given so much data about bad character that they did not or were unable to assess this particular case, as opposed to being poisoned by all of the other witnesses. So this judge and prosecutor were using restraint by not putting all of them on in order to protect a conviction. I know the public may not like to hear that, but you can imagine you don't want to be in a courtroom at a trial, or anybody would be in a courtroom, and having everybody come in for your entire life and say bad things about you.
A prosecutor's still going to try, though.
Yep, I wouldn't. And by the way, there's a precedent set in this case. The judges already ruled to what extent they're going to be allowed to introduce that evidence. So I think the prosecutor, they could certainly make the argument, but I think it will fail. There's a principle in the law where they say once a judge has made a decision in one part of a case, you're not going to relitigate it at another trial. So I don't think that they're going to be more.
But from a defense standpoint, she had also said, listen, it's way too early for Bill Cosby to be celebrating, and I want to bring you in, Nicholas, because it's really he wasn't acquitted.
Yeah, I agree with that. He wasn't convicted, which is better. I would really like to know what the count was. How many people were for conviction? How many people were against conviction? That's a big factor in a prosecutor determining whether or not they should retry a case. If they convinced 11 jurors, but there was only one holdout, that would lead towards a retrial, and the converse is true. I would say it's really problematic for a prosecutor to bring on prior accusations. I think most appellate courts would find it more prejudicial than probative, or it's not relevant to what happened in this particular case. They're going to find that the defendant was prejudiced by it and overturn it on appeal. I was surprised that the judge allowed that kind of testimony in this particular case. And you could tell this was not a good case for the prosecution, even with that testimony, and it weighs heavy on a jury that he committed these acts in the past. They still couldn't get a conviction.
Okay, let's start with you, Nicholas, because I want to focus a little bit on this jury pool and the fact that, yes, this was day 11, but it was day 6 of deliberations, and these particular jury members had gone back and forth to the judge at least 12 times, asking a number of questions. And I wanted to ask you, what, when you learned that they were going back and forth to the judge, asking very specific questions, meaning the definition of reasonable doubt, the definition of without her knowledge, what did that tell you when you heard they were asking those questions?
It reflects a debate among the jurors. So there's a difference of opinion between the jurors as to what, you know, a particular charge meant, or what was said, or the impression of what was said during testimony. So it gets to a point where they can't resolve it within the jury room. They come back and ask for it to be read, or ask for an explanation from the judge. So you could tell right from the beginning these jurors weren't seeing the case the same way. There was a debate. We just don't know how many people were on each side of that debate.
Okay, but I want to get Bob's reaction, because, Bob, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was split 50-50. There could be one person who was hung up on one thing.
Absolutely. We just don't know right now. It's likely, given the magnitude of this case, that we will find that out. But if you've been doing this as long as I have, what was very clear to me is that they're asking for copious readback. As a prosecutor, this is getting you nervous. You're like, wow, they don't remember the testimony. They're asking for instructions on the law. When this was going on, I said, we are just 1 second away from the ultimate bad question for the prosecution. Can you please redefine reasonable doubt? It was very clear that this jury was putting a lot of time and attention. Maybe there was one juror, maybe there were 7 jurors, who knows now. But it was very clear to me that they were challenging the facts, they were challenging the law, and when they asked for reasonable doubt, it was clear to me it was at a minimum a mistrial, and that's exactly what happened. This prosecutor's case was not well received by this jury in terms of them believing guilt, all 12 of them, beyond a reasonable doubt based on all of that.
Right.
Nicholas, let's talk a little bit about what Mr. Cosby was charged with in this case. There's been 60 women who have accused him in one way or another of sexual assault, almost all of those cases involving the use of some type of sedatives that were given to these women. But in this case, he's charged with 3 counts. Aggravated indecent assault, because Mr. Cosby allegedly used his fingers to have sexual contact with the victim. Count 2, aggravated indecent assault, because the victim was allegedly unconscious or semi-conscious and could not give consent. Count number 3, Cosby gave her an intoxicant that substantially impaired the victim. Hung jury on all 3 of those. Very specifically, what did the prosecution have to prove? What did they fail to prove in this?
Well, a couple of things. I think that there was inconsistency in her reporting of the crime, or the alleged crime. There was inconsistencies with her behavior and the allegations that occurred here. She spoke to him, or had telephone calls with him, some 72 times after the alleged incident. That says a lot to a jury. That indicates that, you know, this is not a person who might have not been attacked. You know, that circumstantial evidence that something else was going on between them at the time. The other issue is when she was giving the drugs, did she consent to take the drugs? Because, you know, what happens after that, not necessarily is considered, you know, that she couldn't give consent, I'm sorry, but they have to look at what she was thinking at the time when she took the drugs.
All right, Bob, Nicholas, stand by.